Jesus and 3 of his disciples were returning from Mount Tabor, where he was transfigured, and back into the trouble of the real world. The experience on the mountain was heavenly, but Christ had to come back to deal with the faithlessness of a people who did not understand his teachings. With only 40 days until his passion, Christ still had a lot of teaching to do. Christ's teachings often made people, especially the Jewish Pharisees and scribes, very uncomfortable. They pushed the Jews towards the true meaning behind the laws and commandments of God, but with hard hearts, they would often ignore and even rebel against Jesus' teachings. There was a boy who was possessed by a demon who could not be cast out by the disciples who did not accompany Christ to Mount Tabor. The boy's father begged Christ to heal his son, saying, "Teacher, I brought you my son who has a mute spirit, and wherever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, but they could not. And often he has thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." The demon was in the boy since childhood. This is why exorcisms are done on young children before baptism in the Orthodox Church. The demons, who care about nothing, seek only to destroy. One of the themes in this narrative is faith. The boy is not healed because of a lack of faith. After Jesus is told by the boy's father that his own disciples could not cure him, Jesus says, "O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you?" Jesus knows that his passion will come soon, and the disciples are not ready to be left alone yet. Jesus is also commenting on the faith of the boy's father. He says to him, "If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes." Christ is not saying that if you wish for something hard enough, that you will get it. Faith in God does not grant wishes as a magical genie. Rather, those who are granted the ability to work wonders do so as a gift from God when they understand God's will and do those things that please God for the salvation of man. The scriptures indicate that this man was extremely weak in faith, as is evident at 4 points. From Christ saying that all things are possible to him that believes, from the saying of the man himself as he approached, "Help my unbelief," from Christ commanding the devil to enter into him no more, and from the man saying again to Christ, "If you can." The father replies, "Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief." This brings us to the question of what Jesus Christ considers faith. Faith is not just knowing something to be true. Simply knowing that Jesus Christ is God does not warrant faith, for even the devil knows as much. Faith, rather, is worshiping him as King and God and obedience to his will. Faith is complete trust in God. The elements of fire and water, which the demon would often throw the boy into, are symbols of chaos, and chaos is from the devil. The devil takes that which God created for good and makes it destructive. It says that when Christ rebuked and expelled the demon, the spirit cried out, convulsed him greatly, and came out of him, and he became as one dead, so that many said, "He is dead." Though it was the boy who fell on the ground, it was the devil in him who was in anguish. The possessed boy was merely convulsed, while the usurping spirit was being convicted by the awesome judge. When the disciples were alone with Christ again, they asked why they weren't able to cast out the demon. Christ responded, "This kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting." This is to remind the disciples that it is not them who are doing the miracles, but that God is working through them. The powerful combination of prayer and fasting can overcome powerful demons, because that is how faith is strengthened. This is a powerful message for us in fighting our own spiritual battles. If a man prays so that he may throw out someone else's demons, how much more so that he may cast out his own demons? To fast is to give up earthly pleasures for spiritual grace. It is an emptying of oneself, and prayer then fills the individual with God, who can do anything. The prophets of the Old Testament prayed and fasted before doing wondrous works as well. As the disciples departed from Galilee, Jesus once again told them about his upcoming passion. He knew that their faith was weak and was seeking to prepare them for what was to come. The disciples were sorrowful at what they heard Jesus say. However, they did not really understand what he meant by, "He will rise the third day." They believed in the resurrection, which to them meant that God will raise the righteous on the last day. But what they failed to understand is that Jesus is the resurrection, and that he will arise on the third day of his own power. This next conversation between Christ and his disciples shows once again that they do not understand what is happening. While Jesus is talking about suffering and dying, the disciples were worried about who would be the greatest among themselves. When Jesus questioned them about what they were discussing, they were silent out of embarrassment. However, he already knew, and so he sat them down to teach them. Jesus said, "If anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all." He then took a young child and said, "Assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me." Orthodox tradition says that the young child Christ called to himself would grow up to be Saint Ignatius, the third bishop of Antioch, who retained his childlike innocence until his end, when he was martyred for Christ's sake. There is a difference between being childish and childlike. Christ calls us to be pure and innocent, to trust in him as a young child trusts his father. The kingdom of heaven thwarts the logic of this world. To be greatest in heaven, one must be the least on earth. In the ancient world, children were not seen as significant. Children were lower than slaves. Christ is once again changing the way we understand everything. We must think of ourselves as lower than slaves. A true leader is one who serves, and a true server does not choose how he is going to serve, but takes orders and is obedient. Jesus is God, the leader of all creation, yet he sets this example by going to die for his subjects. He serves us as our leader. Saints Peter and Paul do not become the heads of the apostles because they were the greatest preachers, but because they suffered the most and followed most closely Christ's path. The disciples, still not fully understanding Christ's words, replied through John, saying, "Teacher, we saw someone who does not follow us casting out demons in your name, and we forbade him, because he does not follow us." Jesus answers, saying, "Do not forbid him, for no one who works a miracle in my name can soon afterwards speak evil of me. For he who is not against us is on our side. For whoever gives you a cup of water to drink in my name, because you belong to Christ, assuredly I say to you, he will by no means lose his reward." Christ is showing his disciples that positions and titles do not mean anything, but whoever does the will of God will be greatest in the kingdom. This is also a wake-up call to any so-called Christians who believe that they will enter the kingdom over someone else simply because of their baptism alone. Christ then shows a contrast of who will not enter the kingdom, but rather be first in line to punishment. "But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. Whoever causes harm to one of these lowest of people, the children, would be better off dead, for they would be hurting one who is considered greatest in heaven. It would be as if to harm Christ himself. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter into life maimed, rather than having two hands to go to hell." Christ does not mean this in a literal sense. The Church has condemned mutilation of one's body for spiritual reasons, as this should be understood in a spiritual sense. It would be better for someone to be poor and go to heaven than to be the richest man in the world and go to hell. Christ is making the point that nothing is worth sacrificing oneself for. Our sacrifice should be pleasing to God and not to ourselves or others. This is why Christ says, "For everyone will be seasoned with fire, and every sacrifice will be seasoned with salt. Salt is good, but if the salt loses its flavor, how will you season it? Have salt in yourselves, and have peace with one another." Sacrifices in the Old Testament were meals. A part of the sacrifice was given to God, a part to the priests, and a part to the people. The sacrifice would be seasoned with salt to make it more appetizing to the one it was being offered to. Our sacrifices, therefore, should be made pleasing to God and should not be done to make us feel good or to show off in front of others. This is why Christ said earlier in Matthew 6, "Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men, to be seen by them. Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father in heaven." Our Lord says, "Moreover, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you have gained your brother. But if he will not hear, take with you one or two more, that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And if he refuses to hear them, tell it to the church. But if he refuses even to hear the church, let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector." This is the Christian method of conflict resolution. There are several steps and should be done in this order. Gossip and complaining are not prescribed, as they make things worse. There must be a true desire to reconcile and make peace, not to justify oneself or prove that the other person is wrong. In the final step, Christ says to tell it to the church. This was a strict practice in the early church and should be done more today. If someone does not listen to the church, they are excommunicated. Excommunicating someone from the church was not meant to be permanent, but to give the person a taste of what it is like to be outside of God's grace. Just as God exiled the Israelites in order that they feel the consequences of their sin, so the church occasionally exiles the sinner until they repent and return with a contrite and humble heart. God takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from his way and live.